Afternoon, everyone. I'm excited and thrilled to be hosting this presentation with you all today and to have this discussion on anti-racist pedagogy. So I'm going to now share my screen and kind of get started with today's presentation. Give me a second here. All right, can everyone see the Google slides? Maybe just a thumbs up.
Yes, can definitely see the slides now, Crystal.
Okay, thank you. All right, there we go. It's loading. While that's loading, I'm also going to share with you a drive in Google Drive with some documents and resources for today. So I'm going to share this, and you should receive this in the chat. All right. Okay, so that should give you access to the presentation and a couple of documents that we'll be looking at throughout today's presentation. Okay, so I kind of like to always start out with some objectives and essential questions as to what is going to be our goal for today. So we're going to define anti-racist pedagogy. We're going to be identifying strategies and resources to implement in your own teaching and evaluate the need and importance of anti-racist pedagogy. And at the end of today's session, you'll be able to answer the following questions. What is anti-racist pedagogy? How can I implement this in my coursework? And what does it mean to be an anti-racist educator? So before we kind of get started with that, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the midst of a global pandemic, which highlights the economic and the health disparities that exist in Black and Brown communities, discussions around anti-racism kind of have resurfaced, particularly in the field of education. And the work of scholars of Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, just to name a few, have kind of served as the guiding framework to examine, to challenge, and to dismantle racist policies and ideas. But before we get into what is anti-racist pedagogy, I would like for us to kind of watch a short interview clip with Kendi and DiAngelo, and where they provided context and a rationale for why anti-racism is the cure for racism. So we'll just kind of take a few moments to look at this clip.
Protests over the recent deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor have sparked a renewed dialogue on racism in America. Advocates for reform want policy and governmental changes, but there are also questions about what we can do as individuals to recognize our own inherent racism and to work to change that. As part of our Race Matters series, Anla Nawaz spoke earlier with two scholars to explore racism in America and the concept of anti-racism. Ibram X. Kendi is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he's a professor of history and the founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. Robin DiAngelo is the author of the book, White Fragility, and is a consultant and educator on racial and social justice issues.
So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right in because words matter when we have this discussion, and I want to talk about definitions. So Ibram, let's start with you. A lot of people will say, look, I'm not racist, but in your book, you argue that's not enough. You have to be anti-racist. So what exactly does that mean? What's the difference?
So I define anti-racist as someone who is expressing an anti-racist idea or supporting an anti-racist policy with their action. And very quickly, an anti-racist idea suggest that there's nothing wrong or right, superior or inferior about any racial group. And anti-racist policies are policies that are leading to equity and justice. So the people who are expressing those types of ideas and supporting those types of policies in those moments, they're being anti-racist. And part of being anti-racist is having the willingness to admit the times in which we're being racist. While to be not racist is always to say, even after we just said something that's racist, I'm not racist.
So just to clarify then, even though your book is entitled How To, this isn't some status you achieve, right? Once you're anti-racist, you're always anti-racist?
No, anti-racist isn't a fixed category. So I don't urge people to become anti-racist. I urge people to be anti-racist. And in many ways, being anti-racist is almost like overcoming an addiction. And the first process of overcoming an addiction is first admitting that you have an addiction to racism. And then secondly, spending every day of your life ensuring that you're no longer going back to that, ensuring that you're being anti-racist.
So Robin, let's talk about white fragility then. You talk in your book about the need to embrace anti-racism. How does white fragility fit into this conversation?
The answer to that is connected to what Ibram had just said about denial. We have to start with breaking denial. And one of the challenges is that we've been taught to think about racism as only occurring in individual moments perpetrated by individual people who consciously and intentionally mean to harm other people. And as long as we define it that way, the average white person is not going to see themselves as complicit. When you understand that it's actually the system that we're in, that it's infused across the society, that changes your question from if you are or are not racist to how am I either upholding or challenging racism. But that denial sets us up to be incredibly defensive, and the defensiveness functions to repel any challenge to our complicity. So we're fragile in our inability to withstand those challenges.
It's fair to say there's been a surge of interest in both of your writings in recent weeks for certain. Do you think that that surge of interest means that people are more willing to consider these ideas, to reflect in a way that they haven't before?
Certainly, there's an openness, there's a sense of urgency. It's very clear that this idea that we are post-racial has been stripped away. And if we don't put support around us to keep our attention on this, we will inevitably slip back into comfort with the status quo. Let me just say it. The racist status quo is comfortable for white people. I moved through a society in which racism is the norm, not an aberration.
Ibram, you're very specific in your language about the need to address racist policies and racist institutions. But I think a lot of people are wondering on the grassroots molecular level, what does that mean? How can I be anti-racist in my everyday interactions?
So I think you have people who are reading our work and who are policymakers and can recognize they have the power to change policy within their neighborhoods, within their institutions. Then you also have people who manage policies as they're almost like middle managers, and they can thwart policies that they know to be racist. And then you have every single one of us who can join local organizations that are challenging racist policy. We can fund local organizations and centers that are uncovering and challenging racist policies. We can figure out ways to contribute to that local movement for anti-racist policies. Every single one of us has something to give, and I think we need to figure out what we're going to give to this larger movement.
Robin, I wanted to ask you, I've talked to a lot of people who, white people in particular, who in this moment say, you know, I'm not racist, but I'll tell you one thing, I am not going to be made to feel guilty for being white.
Well, the first thing I would ask someone, a white person who lives their life in segregation, which most white people do, is how do you know that you are not racist. One, that is never put to the test. That if you don't have any accountability, how can you be so confident about that? You know, again, it's not a comfortable examination, but I am clear that as a result of having been raised in this society, that I have internalized racist ideologies and biases, and that I do act on those in various ways. I don't feel guilty about that. I didn't choose that socialization. What I feel is responsible for the outcome.
Ibram, it's worth pointing out that as you were writing this book, you yourself were diagnosed with a very serious, very late stage cancer. How did that inform how you did the work? And you also draw the parallel between cancer and racism in America.
When we diagnose individuals as being racist, they typically hurt really badly, and they typically view us as attacking them, attacking who they are. By contrast, when I was diagnosed as having stage 4 colon cancer, you know, it was devastating to hear, but I didn't view that doctor as seeking to attack me, or I didn't view that doctor as seeking to hurt me. I actually viewed that doctor as seeking to help me. And so I think that's the first parallel for us to realize when you're being diagnosed as racist, the purpose is to help. And then when we think about the way in which we go about treating cancer, particularly metastatic cancer, that's how we can treat metastatic racism, particularly within a society. And so there's typically a local treatment in which doctors go in and surgically remove the tumors in the way we can go in and surgically remove racist policies. And doctors do a systemic treatment in which they flood the body with the chemotherapy, which is equivalent to flooding the body with anti-racist policies that have been proven to reduce racial inequity. But I think it's critically important for us to recognize that this nation has metastatic racism. And in order for us as a country to be healed, there's going to be pain. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of pain. But we recognize, like when we go through the pain of healing from a serious illness, that there is joy, that there is equity on the other side.
There's a lot of work to be done and hopefully joy ahead. And that is Ibram Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Robin DiAngelo, the author of
Okay, so from that video, there were at least 2 points that I think kind of focus to what we're going to be doing and talking about today. And that it also relates to our work in higher ed. And first, as an institution of higher education, we should be constantly critiquing and examine the ways we create and perpetuate racial inequities. A question we should consider is, how are racist ideas and policies embedded and carried out in our teaching and our research? And then second, central to anti-racism is equity and justice. So what would an equitable and just classroom look like, and how do we get there? So how do we get there?
Protests over the recent death.
We get there through anti-racist pedagogy. So there's 2 definitions that I want us to kind of look at right now. So first is a definition by Kendi. And here he's talking about anti-racism is someone who is actively supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions, or expressing an anti-racist idea. An anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equal in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. Here, so when we're thinking about our teaching, what are some of the racist policies that could be contributing to racial inequities between white and BIPOC students? Could it be our grading policies? Could it be the curriculum and the content that we teach? Might the curriculum be grounded in Eurocentric and Western ideas that marginalize the perspectives and the knowledge of underrepresented groups? Then we have this definition for anti-racism. And if any of you attended the Cultivating Community dialogue that we had a couple of weeks ago, we kind of interrogated some of these definitions. And this was one of the definitions that we introduced. And here it says anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. And so in this definition, we're looking at this more from an institutional level and the importance of changing policies, our practices, and our attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. And I think this definition is important as it pinpoints power and the role it plays in creating oppressive and hierarchical structures. And then, of course, we have pedagogy, which is how we teach, our methods and our strategies that we utilize when we teach. So when we put those two together, we have, this definition of anti-racism or anti-racist pedagogy. And according to Blakeney, anti-racist pedagogy is a paradigm located within critical theory, utilized to explain and counteract the persistence and impact of racism using praxis as its focus to promote social justice for the creation of a democratic society in every aspect. And just to give you a little bit more background on what anti-racist pedagogy or how it emerged. So again, it comes from both critical theory and multicultural education. Critical theory, which of course was a Marxist inspired movement which critiqued hegemonic structures to again understand how and why people are dominated and oppressed. And then also multicultural education, which was developed during the civil rights and the Black Power movements to kind of address the lack and failure of higher ed in teaching and providing courses of Black history. And then from that, we had the inclusion of other ethnic studies classes and women's and gender studies, and then also disability studies. But kind of going back to this definition, anti-racism pedagogy examines the ways racism is ingrained in our everyday practice and how we shift from theory to praxis, which is the utilization of knowledge and skills and reflection to create equitable and just learning experiences and opportunities for everyone. I want to say too that anti-racist pedagogy is for all students. So it can affirm the historical and lived experiences of our BIPOC students, but it also provides the knowledge and tools for our white students to kind of serve as allies and co-conspirators in the work to dismantle racism. So again, key to anti-racist pedagogy is that we understand the role, impact of race on the opportunity and cultural differences. So for instance, many of our students, understanding that for some of our students that come to Geneseo with different high school experiences that were impacted by socioeconomic status on top of race. So some students come from privileged backgrounds where they were given and granted access to rigorous coursework and resources, whereas others were not afforded the same opportunities. And this is an example of how racial and economic inequities kind of contribute to the perpetuation and actually the preparation of students for college and academic life. Also key to anti-racist pedagogy is having the courage to confront and tackle racism without fear and ostracism from colleagues, students, and parents, etc. If you're fearful of this, then you may need to take the necessary steps to overcome this before embracing an anti-racist approach to your teaching. And then lastly, an anti-racist is constantly self-reflecting and actively doing and thinking of ways to disrupt the system. So this is about transformation of yourself and in turn, transformation of institutions and society by teaching others about the critical need for anti-racism. So we're gonna look at 4 steps today. And the first step is acknowledgement of race, racism, and anti-racism. Kendi again says that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify it and describe it and then dismantle it. And so what I want us to think about, and I like to have some conversation because I don't want to spend the whole time just talking at you, but hopefully people will feel free to join in and share some of their thoughts. But key to this, again, is thinking about the ways your discipline has been constructed, supported by white supremacy, and how, you know, it kind of further perpetuates maybe racial inequalities. So in what ways is the social construction of race and or the impact of racism present in the discipline or the subject that you teach? And if anyone's willing to share their thoughts, please feel free to jump in. So when you're thinking about your specific discipline, you may want to take a couple of moments to think about this. What role does race and racism play, and what is the impact of that? Because this is the first step, is to understand how our disciplines is shaped by racism. Any thoughts?
Hi, this is Cynthia. Well, working in the museum and gallery system had been perpetually biased in areas of race and class, whereas as early as recent as like the 1980s, the late 70s, many people who worked in museums thought you couldn't teach somebody to be a curator or a museum director because it was supposed to be something innate. And of course, we know that's not true. It's just a matter of who you want to allow to participate. And really, it's still, people can say that, well, there's a lot of Black artists being shown now. There are some, there's not a lot. There's the few who have garnered the attention of wealthy individuals who have aligned with them. So one's participation in a museum is dependent upon, you know, class as well as race. So one of the things that I've been trying to do here is open up in a small way a truly expansive kind of exhibition program showing women and people of color, and to show that, you know, anyone, you know, all can have a particular view of what is and what's possible in the arts.
Thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. So yeah, as just from your discussion there, we can definitely see how even in various disciplines, like as you mentioned, art, race is very prevalent. Any other examples?
I can comment a little bit on biology. So right now I'm teaching Bio 117, which is the gateway course for the biology major. It's the entry point, and we certainly see enormous disparities in terms of the preparation that students have. And the population that is underprepared is disproportionately likely to be people of color. Not exclusively, there are others as well. But the other thing is that what we study in Biology 117 includes genetics, and genetics obviously has a history of being abused in service of racism in the past. And there's still, even though biology as a whole doesn't have that same slant, there's still vestiges of it that show up in textbooks, like referring to mutations in human populations as being defects, which, especially since one that we study quite often is the sickle cell trait, which is it's a wonderful example for showing the interrelationships between genes and environment and the whole body, the whole phenotype, but it also, I'm struggling for words here. It also, by singling out a trait that is common among African Americans, I think also can make students very uncomfortable. And so one of the things I've tried to do is diversify the examples that I use to show that all human populations have traits like this, but it's still a legacy of the past in biology.
Yeah. No, I think you bring up an excellent point, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later too, is that particularly when we're talking about issues around race and racism, we typically are looking at through the lens of oppression and victimization. But we also want to highlight elements and narratives of joy, resistancy, and resilience. And so it kind of is a balance between, this idea of, the horrible impacts and effects of racism, but also the ways in which people counter that through, again, examples of resistance, resiliency, and joy. So I think that's an excellent point that you bring up. Any other examples?
I can share.
Cheryl?
Oh.
Who else was talking? I
Go
can.
ahead, Cheryl.
Okay.
It's all you.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. Well, in my area of literacy and literature, what I'm very conscious of are the materials that we use to teach reading, and also the materials that will support that teaching of reading, and trying through, for instance, my international children's literature class, I'm hoping to help build understandings of, one, how culture matters and respect for culture. So in other words, moving toward a multicultural and also a socially responsive pedagogy. And one thing that's really been very interesting is to watch students become aware that issues of ethnicity, in this case, speaking directly to race, it's not something that is just happening in the United States. Although I think we need to work on what we're doing here, but I think them seeing globally that it is an issue.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. When we think about anti-Blackness, it is a global issue. We've seen elements of, and I know you're talking more specifically in terms of literacy, but just overall, I think it's important that students have a global understanding of anti-Blackness and racism from a global perspective. Because, right now, even in Nigeria, we see elements of police brutality, and we've seen it also in Brazil and other places around the world where Black and brown people are constantly being targeted and experiencing horrible violence around racism. So that's an excellent point. I think there was one more person that was going to mention something.
It was me. So I'm from the Department of Anthropology, and anthropologists are among some of the most egregious violators of racism. Biological anthropologists were involved in the project of trying to make an argument that there was a biological foundation for racial differentiation, and that those differentiations were related to things like intelligence and capability, as well as anthropologists still today are capable of a lot of work, what's the word I'm looking for, exoticizing ethnic and racial others. So this is something that within the discipline, a lot of people are working on. We have the Association of Black Anthropologists who are doing really cutting edge work to push anthropology toward anti-racism and really thinking critically about our past, our theories, and the ways that we move forward from that in the way that we teach as well.
Yes. I read Stamped from the beginning, Ibram Kendi's, one of his books, and he talks about the work of anthropologists and this idea of scientific racism and how it really has served as the formation of how racist ideas were formulated and started here across the world, but also in the United States. So yes, that's definitely a discipline that we can definitely examine and learn from. So thanks for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and move on for the sake of time and move on to our second step. And our second step, go back here, is critical self-reflection. So understanding who you are as an individual and how your identities inform and shape your beliefs, your worldview, and values. And this is particularly important as educators because who we are, again, shapes how we teach and our interactions with our students. So, questions to think about is, who are you? And what ways are you privileged? What biases do you hold? What are the expectations you have for students? And how might this be grounded in your own worldview, values, and beliefs? So I'm gonna do a quick little exercise. And what I would like for you to do, if you have maybe a sheet of paper around you, or you could do this in your head, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna give you about a minute or so. And if I want you to complete this sentence, I am blank, right? How would you describe yourself, right? So just maybe 1 minute to kind of think about all the ways you would describe yourself. About 20 seconds. Okay, so if anyone's comfortable, would anyone be willing to share maybe a couple of traits or ways that they describe their identity or who they are?
Crystal, I put for my who am I, I'm a straight white male, husband, father, and academic.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Anybody else?
So mine looked very similar to Dave's. I started out by saying I'm a white heterosexual cisgendered male. And that's not a description I would have given of myself several years ago, but it became very important to me to recognize all of the ways in which I'm privileged, because many of the things that follow from that, husband, educator, educated, et cetera, would have been more difficult for me to have obtained had I not held many of those privileged categories.
Right, right. Anybody else? So this is an activity that was created by, or something that Beverly Tatum, who is an educator and has a background in psychology, and I actually think has an honorary degree here from Geneseo. And she does this activity with her students, and I've done this with my students, and it is very telling. And I'm just gonna read to you what she says and how she describes this. She says, which parts of our identity capture our attention first? While there are surely idiosyncratic responses to this question, a classroom exercise I regularly use with my psychology students reveals a telling pattern. I ask my students to complete the sentence, I am blank, using as many descriptors as they can think of in 60 seconds. All kinds of trait descriptions are used: friendly, shy, assertive, intelligent, honest, and so on. But over the years, I have noticed something else. Students of color usually mention their racial or ethnic group. For instance, I am Black, Puerto Rican, Korean American. White students who have grown up in strong ethnic enclaves occasionally mention being Irish or Italian, but in general, white students rarely mention being white. When I use this exercise in co-educational settings, I notice a similar pattern in terms of gender, religion, and sexuality. Women usually mention being female, while men don't usually mention their maleness. Jewish students often say they are Jews, while mainline Protestants rarely mention their religious identification. A student who is comfortable revealing it publicly may mention being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Though I know most of my students are heterosexual, it is very unusual for anyone to include their heterosexuality on their list. Common across these examples is that in the areas where a person is a member of the dominant or advantaged social group, the category is usually not mentioned. That element of their identity is so taken for granted by them that it goes without comment. It is taken for granted by them because it is taken for granted by the dominant culture. The parts of our identity that do capture our attention are those that other people notice and that reflect back to us. While there may be countless ways one might be defined as exceptional, there are at least 7 categories of otherness commonly experienced in US society. People are commonly defined as other on the basis of race or ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, and physical or mental ability. Each of these categories has a form of oppression associated with it: racism, sexism, religious oppression, anti-Semitism, heterosexism, classism, ageism, and ableism, respectively. In each case, there's a group considered dominant, systematically advantaged by the society because of group membership, and a group considered subordinate or targeted, systematically disadvantaged. When we think about our multiple identities, most of us will find that we are both dominant and targeted at the same time, but it is the target identities that hold our attention and the dominant identities that go unexamined. Any thoughts on what Tatum just said, or what I just read about Tatum? About aspects of our identities.
When I started compiling my list, I realized I don't very often have to compile my list, which I think was Tatum's point.
Right. Exactly.
I think it speaks to privilege as well, in simply that the non-targeted portions of our identity are our privileges, and that's why they don't call it attention to themselves, and they fly under the radar, whereas for example, being a woman would be something that I would notice some inequities of at points in my life, and so that is very prevalent to me.
Any other thoughts?
I wonder if others have noted like a change in recent years. I'm just finding with students when we're doing exercises similar to this in class, I'm finding a little bit like what Joe and Dave said, that they're more cognizant, it's more kind of present in mind than it was historically, and I find that to be true for myself as well. That those things are more present in mind about the ways that I'm privileged. And then the other thing that was 2 categories that Tatum didn't mention that were salient for me is I thought about citizenship and about language.
Yes.
And I think those are other areas of privilege as well that could be included in there.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I will say that this was kind of written, I want to say back in 2000. So I think definitely, particularly what's going on with immigration, notions of citizenship and language would be more prevalent today than maybe so during the time she wrote this article. But when we think about this in terms, again, as our role as educators, why is this important that we understand who we are and aspects of our identity? So when we're planning our courses, when we're designing our reading lists, when we're interacting with our students, why is it important that we are aware of our multiple identities? Why is this important?
Hi, Crystal, this is Sam. I think that we bring those blind spots. We bring them in what we don't bring. I think that that certainly has been, for me, through graduate school, which was really the first place that I dug into more taking stock of my identity and being conscious of what I bring and what I don't bring, introduced me to those concepts, and certainly have working professionally in higher education has helped contribute to a greater awareness of what I bring and what I don't bring, and the importance of coalition building and collaborative approaches to education.
Yeah, excellent point. I like this idea of blind spots. So what is it that we're unaware of, right? What is kind of like that cultural iceberg? What are the hidden meanings and assumptions that maybe we hold or that other people's hold?
I think one of the things I'm thinking about, Crystal, this is Mary Ellen from School Business, is I think these questions are wonderful when you ask them of students, because they're open, and whatever they come up with, you have to work with it, but you can manage it. I'm thinking when you ask these of faculty, and obviously the people who are here are people who are open to learning these things, and I'm thinking about as a unit leader, if you will, I have faculty who we're trying to think about these issues, and I think for some of the faculty, these questions are very difficult and very, I don't want to say threatening to identity, or either threatening or they just, there's some armor there. So one of the things that I think is that I'd like us to think about, and maybe it's the next seminar, is how do you work with people who are not as open to some of these questions and ways of seeing, because some of them genuinely don't see it this way, and they have their reasons. And so I guess I'm just putting that out there. And I'll just also say one more thing, at least in our school, and Robbie's worked with us on this, but I have over half my faculty are international. So for them, racism has a different connotation. Say they're from India, they've experienced racism there, and actually some of them said it's not as bad, as it was worse there than what they see here. So you'd think they'd be more empathetic, but that's not necessarily the case. So I'm just throwing some things out there to chew on.
Right. No, I think those are excellent points. Going to your last point there, talking about international faculty, yes, that's an excellent point, because when we think about racism here in this country, it's mostly dealing with Black people, right? And the experiences that Black people have had throughout, since the founding, 1619, and even more recently. So definitely, it is very different. Certain groups, even, I think that's why the term BIPOC has really emerged, because when we clump and use the term people of color, we're making the assumption that all people of color have some of the same lived experiences. But, Black, Indigenous have different experiences from, other groups, like you said, Asians and people from India. So it's important. That's an important thing for us to really reflect on. And then also, which leads to that last question, are you ready to do this work even when it becomes uncomfortable? So, to really take an anti-racist approach or pedagogy to your teaching, you have to buy into this idea that it matters, that it's important. And for some of our colleagues, they're not there yet. It would be our hope and goals that they are. And we have to think about the ways in which we can make this type of work accessible to all, make them feel comfortable and safe in their transformation as they are learning about this as well. So I think those are some valid points that you raise, and thank you for doing so. Any other thoughts before we move on?
this is Meg from Residence Life. I also want to point out that I think part of this is an ease thing. It's easier to not do this. I think that it's much easier to keep doing the things that you've always been doing, the way that you were taught, the people that helped you do the things that you were doing, because we don't always have time to do that. And sometimes you you get a bit, I guess, when you are able to do some of this and change a couple things, but not the other things. And people notice that, like, oh, you missed this one. And that's what they're pointing out, which can feel very defeating. Like I am trying, but it's never going to be enough. And so to some extent, just like leaving it aside is an easier thing to do than try to have this conversation with yourself or with others.
Definitely. And, there's nothing comfortable about racism. I think, the work of Robin DiAngelo kind of talks about this idea of white fragility. And there's a lot of guilt associated when talking about racism for many white people. But, we can't let that stop us. And we have to, do this work if we're really going to make any headway or try to dismantle any racist structures, particularly in our institutions. So this work needs to be done, most definitely. Step 3 is decolonizing the curriculum. So when we're thinking about when we begin to create our syllabi for our courses, how are we being attentive and acknowledging, as we go back to step 1, the ways in which race and racism is embedded in our disciplines? So how are we creating outcomes that address power, social justice, and the social and historical production of knowledge, as well as the role of race and racism on society? And then there's also a suggestion that we should include anti-racist statements in our syllabi. And if you were to go to the folder that I shared with you earlier, you will see a link there, syllabus design and diversity and inclusion syllabus statements. I would show it on my screen, but it's sometimes difficult going back and forth between presentations and another screen. So if you look at those 2 links, the first one, syllabus design, open that up on your computers. Here's kind of a checklist that was kind of created these are things you might want to think about as it relates to your syllabus. So you've included a statement on equity and justice. Again, this is the first one on designing the syllabus. You've included like personal goal statements, course outcomes and goals and expectations that are centering the learning of BIPOC students. So I'm going to give you a minute or two, just kind of scroll through there, see if anything kind of stands out to you or something that you think you could use in your own coursework. And if you see something that you think intrigues you or something you may have a question about, please feel free to share. And then if you're also able to look at the diversity and inclusion syllabus statements, these are examples of statements you can include in your syllabus or questions you should consider as you're creating a syllabus statement around anti-racism. Something we should also be aware of is thinking about whose scholarship and research we are centering in our coursework, and the importance of diversifying our content. So are we including by POC scholarship and research? Or are we including perspectives from women and gender nonconforming authors in our reading list for students as it relates to our discipline? So I want you to kind of reflect on the courses that you're teaching and think about, are there learner outcomes or course goals that promote equitable outcomes? If not, what could be a learner outcome or course goal that you could create and implement? And again, thinking about whose scholarships do you privilege in your course? How many of those are scholars of color, women, or gender nonconforming researchers?
Okay. Well, let's pick one.
So any thoughts on that? Does anyone have any learner outcomes or course goals that speak to anti-racism or the acknowledgement of race and racism in their discipline? Or does anyone have an anti-racist statement in their syllabi that they're willing to share or talk about their thought process behind that?
So, I mean, I don't have one, but I will make one, create one for the spring for my course. But I also would like to comment on, like you mentioned about the resources you use in your class for teaching. Well, I developed this class, African Americans in New York City, 1868 to 1917, and it was a bit of a challenge to find some material, but I did. And one book that I thought was really good in some parts was really terrible in other parts. So that I censored what the students read so as not to put new forms of disparaging language into their heads, you know. So, and I feel like, you know, so that for this spring, have to find whole new resources for that, so that I don't, because the same discussion can be had without, you know, giving students new racial, you know, disparaging language.
Yes. Thank you.
This is Susan Bandoni Minch again. For my multicultural core science class, I think I've done some of this. Wouldn't say I've done all of it, but it's been much harder in my other classes. There isn't a diversity of options for readings for some classes, like freshman biology, that they're all pretty similar in terms of presenting a body of knowledge that is largely generated by people with considerable privilege and that excludes other people's questions or concerns. And so there's really not a lot of choice in some disciplines.
Right, and that's an excellent point too, and I'm going to bring that up in our last step here, is that anti-racist pedagogy is not just about the content that we teach, but it's also how we teach. So for some courses, there may not be, you know, any way that you might can make direct, you know, connections to issues around race or racism, but how we teach the course, right, can still align with an anti-racist pedagogy. So thank you for bringing that up.
Crystal, if I could jump in for a second, I think Megan raises a really good question in the chat. Megan was asking, as a non-teaching professional, how can our office relay anti-racist ideals to students? I think there are a lot of ways that we can incorporate these anti-racist principles through our website, through our policies, making it very clear that everything we do is from an anti-racist lens. I don't know if you have any more thoughts or like to address that at all. And Megan,
Yeah.
I know you're in financial aid.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, is that, maybe this is maybe geared more towards, those that are actually teaching, but I think part of the broader conversation and part of the work of our, subcommittee is thinking about the policies that, we are enacting that are impacting our students across the board that are very detrimental to their academic success here on campus. And so, yes, I think we need to think broadly here too, as well as, like, as I mentioned before in the very beginning, what are some of those racist policies that we are, using, embedding in our, whether it's our coursework, our grading policies, our honor policies, around student life. So I think that's an excellent point. And I just would encourage, everyone to kind of continue, learning through some of our programming that we're going to be offering throughout the semester and next semester, to get some more ideas and strategies.
I can also say that there's actually a strong argument for professional offices to also write learning outcomes. How you teach, if you want, looks different. And so if you're thinking about you have one-on-one interactions with students, you have sessions that you're holding. There are things that your office already does that interfaces with students. And so you can, as an office, you can set learning outcomes for what do I want my students to get out of those experiences after they do this. Sure, some of it's going to be like related to the actual content, right? Like about financial aid, but you can also set learning outcomes that are related to them feeling included, them feeling like they can come back to the office, and things like that you can embed some of those the anti-racist things in.
Right, exactly. Learner outcomes and goals, or it shouldn't just be something that we embed in our academic classes, but definitely when we're thinking about other departments and areas on campus, those are things we can actually, start working on, is creating what are the goals that we want to, work towards as it relates to anti-racism. So yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Any other final thoughts on decolonizing the curriculum? And then the final step, which kind of gets at what I was mentioning. Well, first, let me share this with you. So here's an example of a learning goal. This was created by a faculty member at Brown. This is a science-related course, biotechnology. So you could just get a sense of what a learning goal may look like. So here, understand how non-inclusiveness of biomedical research may bias the distribution of benefits, harms, and risks for people, stakeholders, and communities. Analyze your assumptions and beliefs when working to facilitate civic engagement that makes a difference for people from other places and experiences. And then recognize power imbalances and issues of trust that marginalize people from research. So again, this is just one example of what a learning goal could look like in a class. Particularly, this is as I mentioned, a biotechnology class. And so our last step is to reflect and change your teaching. So as I mentioned before, anti-racist pedagogy goes beyond just thinking about the content that we teach, but also how we're teaching. So the first thing is building relationships with students. So research has shown that when students have relationships, that's grounded in respect, with their professors, their likelihood for academic success is very high. So thinking about the ways we're doing that. Now, that's very hard and challenging, particularly now if you're teaching online, but there still are ways in which we can build those relationships with students. I just had a colleague share with me the other day, she's teaching strictly online, and she makes a point to reach out to 5 students weekly. And just to send them a short email to say, I'm checking in on you, hope you're well, how's everything, how your class is going. And that kind of helps, and she said that her students really appreciated that they felt that their professors cared for them, that they understood the challenges that are associated with online learning and doing so within a pandemic, on top of all the racial strife that we're experiencing, in our country and the upcoming election. So we're all right now you know, a little stressed and, you know, worried. And so kind of building those relationships with our students is very crucial. Also thinking about maybe surveys that you can give to students at the beginning of the academic semester. So checking in, maybe asking questions about, you know, what are they hoping to learn and gain from the course? What are some fears that they have? What are maybe some things that they would like for you to know as a professor? So just building those relationships. I know that I asked my students, I created a Google slideshow. I asked them to upload a picture if they felt comfortable and to tell me a little bit about themselves and to record their message so that I could kind of get a sense of who they are since I could not see them face to face. So it's important that we think about this as part of anti-racist pedagogy. Second thing is to provide opportunities for student-centered learning that's grounded in inquiry and problem-posing education. So this is giving students a choice. I've seen this described in some courses as I was doing some research, where professors will incorporate and include specific days in their syllabus where they allow students to kind of select the topics or themes that they might feel that they're more interested in. Provide opportunities for students to kind of also self-select homework assignments. So a professor I was reading on had created like 30 or 40 homework assignments and asked students to kind of select a couple of those. And these were short, these aren't long homework assignments, but they, again, allow students to demonstrate what they've learned from the course. And it also speaks to different learning styles and needs of students. So it's kind of taking more of an equitable approach to learning. And they're allowing students to make direct connections to the content and of what they're learning to their own personal lives. And so they felt that that was really important, and it led to a more student-centered experience. And they also allowed opportunities for students to lead discussions, whether these are discussions around issues of race or racism, or issues or discussions around current events. Again, it gives students a voice. So it's not just the professor lecturing and teaching, but the students have some agency in their learning as well. As I mentioned earlier, it's important that we do include narratives and experiences grounded in joy, resistance, and resiliency. So when we're not just focusing on you know, the violence and the levels of oppression that are experienced by POC people, but we're also learning about the ways in which people countered that through, you know, different means. For instance, if you're teaching about enslavement, you're not just teaching about, you know, the system itself, but the ways in which those fought against it, right? So some of the slave resistance, the rebellions. The fourth thing here is set clear guidelines and expectations for class discussions on race and check for microaggressions. This is also important, and I've heard many students just through my informal conversations share with me experiences where professors would call on them directly to share about their experiences to kind of serve as a representative of their race or culture, and that's putting the student on the spot, and that's a practice we definitely do not want to embrace and incorporate in our teaching. So it's important that, you know, when we are having these discussions, that we do set clear guidelines, that students understand how they should engage in dialogue. Fifth thing, make your course texts and materials accessible to your students. When we're selecting our texts, our books, thinking about the cost that's associated with those materials. We have to think about, even now as we're in online learning, what are the barriers to technology, right? Thinking about bandwidth, or if we're having students participate in, you know, synchronous discussions, is that equitable for all students? So again, making sure that our course contexts, our texts and our materials are accessible to our students. This is one that even I really didn't think about, and I'm really going to take this as I move forward, and this is taking an anti-racist approach to assessment and grading. So providing feedback that really encourages students' growth and high expectations, and then setting clear and transparent guidelines for assignments and grading. If we go back to the resources that I shared with you earlier, there's a link there that says transparency in learning and teaching. And if you click on that link, it's going to take you to this site where it talks about how we should set up expectations for assignments and for our grading. If you scroll down to the bottom, there are some example assignments. And if you click on one, so I'm just going to, for instance, click on the sociology one. What it will do is it will show you a less transparent assignment. So what an assignment would look like if you don't incorporate any kind of transparency, and then one at the bottom that does. So the idea here is that we should share with students what it is that we're expecting them to learn, what are the skill sets that they will come away with the assignment, and then the task itself. So explicit directions for completing the assignment, as well as their criteria and how we're going to grade and assess the students. I mean, when we think about the academic success of students on our campus, it is tied to evaluation and assessment, right? How well they're doing in the course, whether it's through tests or just other assignments, essays and whatnot. So it's important that if we're going to take an anti-racist approach to our teaching, that we're really being self-reflective on the types of assignments that we're giving students and whether or not they're very explicit in their directions. And then the last thing here is have a faculty peer observe your teaching and curriculum for feedback. Reach out to people who, or who are well-versed in the work, and, ask them for suggestions, ask them to take a look into your Canvas course, or, if we ever come back to online, face-to-face teaching, to come into your class and observe your teaching and give you feedback on ways in which you can improve your practice. So again, it's not just what we teach, but how we teach. And these are just some suggestions that we should take into consideration. The last slide, and just for the sake of time, because I do want to get to questions and other conversations, again, you have access to this slide in the folder, but here is a scholar who's kind of done work around this idea of assessment, and just quick kind of 30-minute or 30-second videos on how we set up those expectations for when we're creating assignments for students. So I would encourage you to kind of watch that maybe on your own time. But this is definitely an excellent source is for us to think about, again, the ways in which we're creating our assignments and if we're being very explicit in that, so we can set students up for success. And then there's another link there on Antiracist Pedagogy resources, the Anti-Racism and Allyship Classroom. There, if you click there, there's a lot of resources that someone has kind of created. And there's also more discipline-specific resources and strategies. Not every discipline is represented there, but there's some. But this is a great resource if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about how to include anti-racist pedagogy in your teaching and practice. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and kind of go back to view here. Are there any questions or concerns you have?
I have one, which is that for me, one of the barriers to modifying assignments, giving choice, I've tried to do that and it just kills me on the grading. In the Geneseo environment, we're often teaching 3 different things and too many students, and
right.
I wondered if you have some input on that.
Yeah, no, I knew that is going to be even for me, I have 3 sections. I have 90 students this semester, and just trying to think what that would look like in terms of grading. I think would need to be assignments that are more beneficial for the students, and they're just more, I don't know if we would grade them more for accuracy, but just more of like, okay, they participated in this assignment, they get credit for it. So it's more like self-reflective assignments, right? That just allow students to kind of self-reflect on the material, and it's not more for us to be like, oh, I'm checking for this and that. But it does give them a little bit of choice in their learning. So that's an excellent question. And it might not work for like a course that has 100 students, but if it's a smaller class where you have 10 or 15, it might work better.
Okay, so your definition of small is 10 or 15, and
or 20.
Yeah, 20 is small for us. So yeah. And 30 and 50 are pretty common.
Right.
I had a colleague who did what is it called? The ACCC. Dave, you can correct me. And she said that a lot of what she learned in it, or some of what they learned, was about this sort of steps to take to make expectations clear, and really how to make equitable assignments and grading processes. So that might be another stop for those of us who are trying to work on this.
I will say,
Jennifer, you have that exactly right. It is the ACCC, and we are offering a couple of mini ACCC sessions. ACCC stands for Advancing Cultural Competency Certificate. We are offering some mini sessions in November, so keep an eye out on those on the TLC website. Those will be dealing with some issues of implicit bias, microaggressions, structural racism, power, privilege, and to give people a sense of what the Advancing Cultural Competency program is all about. And we'll be opening that up for the campus again in the spring semester.
I will say that I've taken this approach of being very transparent in my assignments, and I can definitely see a difference in the quality of work of my students, and also the grading. I give very explicit instructions. I even give an example of what I'm looking for. I just think it's a better approach to how I design my assignments. And students seem to really understand what it is that I'm looking for and what I want them to do.
I just looked at a couple of examples in that list, and I don't, this is embarrassing to say, but I don't really see much difference between them. Can you elaborate on some of the nature of the differences, maybe?
Which one were you looking at?
I looked at the Science 101 and the biology, the ones that should be closest for me. And the Science 101 is formatted very differently, but the questions look the same.
So I think the whole point of that is that you're setting the purpose for the assignment, what it is that they're learning. Yeah, and that's basically.
So the one is just the questions. Okay, so I was looking for some difference in the questions, and I guess there just isn't.
Yeah, there was a math example, I do think, where instead of having all the students answer all the math questions, they asked them to only answer 2 or 3. It allow for some choice. But I do think the whole purpose here is just setting the expectation for learning, like what it is they're expected to learn, some of the skill sets that so there's a purpose to what it is that they're doing.
Yeah, okay, I always do that. So not that it's necessarily clear, but.
I think just including that on the actual document too is important, versus maybe just verbally stating it, but actually including it on the document is important.
If we have a couple seconds, I would like to bring people attention to the anti-racism incentives that the provost office is offering. These are for courses that will be offered in intersession this January. There are 2 different incentive programs, and I believe we have Paul Schacht and Amanda Wetworth from the Center for Digital Learning on the call here. But one of these incentive programs is specifically for anti-racism, and faculty members can earn a $500 incentive if you are teaching a course that deals centrally with issues of race and racial justice, or it can be adding an anti-racist component to a course that may not deal centrally with race and racism. You could be developing some standalone modules incorporating anti-racist principles in your course. You could be incorporating some additional content, readings, lectures, assignments, assessment activities that are more anti-racist. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to take a look at the blog post that I put a link to in the chat. That goes to the Center for Digital Learning. And the deadline to express interest in those incentives, I believe, is beginning of December 1st. Sam, go. I think you were about to say something too.
Yeah, I have a question for Crystal that probably you can't answer, but we'll give it a try. This session represents a collection of people who have voluntarily given their time to learn more about the topic of anti-racism. How do we begin the conversation with colleagues who maybe, for example, don't believe that racism exists in the United States?
Yeah, I think,
because I assume it needs to start from a place of, I can't call it common ground because that means sharing a perspective, but like, how do you start that conversation?
yeah, that's a great question. I think this is where maybe leadership is really key and important. I think this is maybe where the deans and the chairs, and we already know that, the provost and the president is leading us in that direction of becoming an anti-racist college. But unless I think there's leadership that encourages the departments to really have these conversations, they're not going to be. People aren't going to have them, right? Sure. So it's like, in your department meetings, bringing that up, mm-hmm. and everyone's in the room, so you're opening up that conversation. Now, will everyone be open to it? No, right? But I think this is where we need leadership to kind of step up to the plate and kind of at least begin to open up those conversations and include, bring in like outside people or, have their own like kind of brown bag seminars. Because for a lot of times, it is grounded in fear, and sometimes people just don't know. They're just not aware, right? Because they themselves have grown up in very segregated communities. It's kind of like the video highlights. And so they just don't have the language and to kind of, begin those conversations. But I think we have to start somewhere. And I think that's where the departments are going to have to take the lead and, have, sessions like this, or encourage their faculty and staff to come to these, programs that we're having on campus and, have those because ultimately we're serving our students, and these are the people that we have to keep in mind as we're doing this work.
And one of the comments I put in the chat was that we need to bring the message to those people who are not choosing to come. We hold a number of these sessions over the course of the year through the TLC, through the Office of Diversity and Equity, through many different things. And a lot of times we get the people that are already invested in this change and are already convinced about these issues. We need to start going to department meetings where everybody is required to come to those department meetings. If there are other, division meetings or some other staff meetings that people are required to come to, we need to make this topic a part of those sessions so people are getting educated about these issues, even if they're not choosing to come. So just like, these conversations we're having about our curriculum, we want to design our curriculum so students cannot avoid things like transformational learning activities, international experiences, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to make the same types of changes on our college campus so faculty, staff, community members cannot avoid those issues too.
Thank you. You much more effectively answered it than I expected. So that was a really practical ways to kind of disseminate and engage. Thank you.
Any other questions or concerns about this work?
I mean, my impression in terms of what Dave was saying is that we have to repeat this over and over again, even with, I mean, I think about the chairs meeting. Chairs change every year within some departments, some 3 years, some every 5 years. They're constantly changing. So I think the starting place where it should be repeated is in the chairs meetings, and make sure every time there's a new chair, they're kind of getting exposure to this, because they may have been somebody who has avoided this whole issue up until they become chair. And possibly, like you said, yeah, in department meetings, yeah, it's got to be done over and over again. We get new faculty coming in, we get faculty leaving, staff coming and going. I mean, I brought this up in another issue. We got groups of freshmen coming in every year. This is going to be an ongoing system that's going to have to keep going until we get, well, 90% of the United States on board. Until that happens, we're going to constantly have students coming in with all kinds of issues, and racism is going to be one of them. I mean, we see it now. I've been here 30 years, and I've seen it with different cultural groups who all of a sudden came into America and finally got to the age of coming to college. And next thing they know, they're experiencing a whole bunch of attitudes, racist attitudes toward them. I mean, there was a group of, like 5-10 years ago, we had a number of Korean students, and they were constantly berated. And I can't remember, one of the issues was, oh, they break the curve because they study their butts off and end up the highest in the class. And these students were complaining about that. So it's like, why students complain, I have no idea. Some of it's just beyond me how they could even think of some of these things. But still, but my main statement though is we're going to have to be on top of this every year with every new incoming freshman class, because it's going to be there. And yeah, if we get all this faculty funding on board, that may help, but it's not going to be something that's going to go away in 3 years.
Crystal, can I jump in here for a second?
Sure.
Because what Ed's saying is actually part of what I'm excited about the college's adoption of the anti-racism platform. What he's kind of getting at is that we need to live anti-racist lives. And I'm actually very excited about this. I mean, it wasn't until the college put forth this commitment to the anti-racist platform that I actually started to feel empowered to call out racism both on individual and systemic levels. I've been a member of the campus community for 21 years, and there's been a number of times I've had to bite my lip and put my eyes down and not be able to leverage, again, all of those classes of privilege that I live in to speak up for my friends of color. Knowing that the college is making this commitment makes it easier for me to be able to live out ideals that I hope I can express to others in a fashion that they will adopt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
And Joe, I was thinking the exact same thing when Ed was voicing his concerns. I mean, that's exactly what Kendi is talking about. Our work here is never done as far as becoming anti-racist. We are going to have to be constantly educating ourselves. We're going to have to constantly be educating our fellow students that are coming in, our colleagues. It's never done. And that is the nature of the beast.
I think, and yeah, I just saw this, Cynthia just put this in the chat, and this is kind of what I'm getting at. I think too is accountability, and what happens if we're trying to be an anti-racist college, what happens when we have people who do not align with that framework, right? So they're not adopting anti-racist policies. What does that mean? We can't truly be anti-racist if we have racists in our institution. So, I think that's a hard conversation, but what does that look like? And, do we keep people like that? I mean, I think that's just a hard conversation to have, but it's necessary if we're really going to have an anti-racist college and framework.
I have a question about the language you just used, though, because it seems a little counterintuitive to what Kendi's telling us. You know, the label of racist people, I think, doesn't he take objection with that? Isn't the notion that we have people who may act in a racist fashion, just like individuals who strive to be anti-racist aren't always anti-racist, but striving to be anti-racist? And I only call that out because I think the language is important. I mean, I know people that I have no problem pointing at and saying, you're a racist, because of a long history of behavior, constant racist behavior. But there are individuals who might slip, who just perform in or perform racist behavior, right? I mean, and we can correct those individuals and hope that they come around to adopt anti-racist thoughts and behavior.
Yeah, no, that's why it's a gray area, because he also talks about that no one's inherently racist and no one's inherently anti-racist. So it's always kind of working towards, you know, those goals.
As we reach 1:30 here, Crystal, I'd very much like to thank you for organizing this presentation. I found it particularly very helpful. I loved how you kind of outlined this in steps that we need to take. I'd also like to encourage people to continue to be involved. Monday, November 2nd, we're having our next Cultivating Community session. The overarching theme of all of these Cultivating Community sessions are becoming an anti-racist college. How do we translate our definition of anti-racism into a vision and plan? That is Monday, November 2nd from 2:30 to 3:45. And please keep in touch with us if you have other ideas for programming, if you have questions. This is going to be a recurring theme throughout this year and onward as we work towards becoming an anti-racist college.